Hi, today I have on with me Grant Kilian, the head of sales and separations, and he's going to be discussing drug discovery platforms. Grant, awesome to have you on.
Jeff, thank you very much. I know we've been threatening to do a video together, so this is an honor. And I want to say to everyone watching, I hope you can at least learn something. It's always interesting talking about science in Africa, and it's always quite a passion of everyone at the company. So today I'm talking about setting up a drug discovery platform, and we primarily focusing on Africa as a continent. I mean, this is to us really enabling this type of technology in the region. So let me get to it and then jump into my slides. So the take-home messages, some of the key messages that people will be getting from this video today is, kind of looking and finding the right partner in your region. And by partner, we mean, a lab supply company or a technology company that can really, bring technology to the fore and pretty much enable it, but also support it in your region. We can also be talking about types of drug discovery platforms that we typically see in Africa. Some of the day-to-day technologies, what you need to set up, run a successful drug discovery platform. And then, me, Jeff, I like to do the whole dream big scenario. So how can we combine some of these technologies and really look at how we can dream big and kind of, make really statement type platforms and enable this type of technology. And then, yes, I'll go back to some of the summaries towards the end. I think, for us, learning some skills, building the infrastructure, we want to make sure that we have that platform that everyone as a scientist in Africa, especially in drug discovery in this case, can benefit from that. All right, so or to start off, in terms of your partner, I think, what you want to do is you want to partner with someone that's got a very, very good track record. You don't want to be first of its kind, a guinea pig. You don't want to reinvent the wheel. And support is one of these key aspects that everyone always talks about in the African region, because you'll find that often people have a one-of-a-kind instrument in their region or in their territory, and they're very dependent on that technology. And what you want is a partner that, even though it's one of its kind in your country, it's not one of a kind for the partner that's supporting that on the continent. So I think ultimately where we come in is we support people, we bring consultation to the table, and really try and make sure that our expertise translates. And ultimately, like I said, earlier on, we want to dream big. So hopefully we can tickle some of the people's thinking as we discuss further on.
Yeah, I want to jump in there quickly, Grant, because one thing people often overlook is you have line of sight often of what's happening in other areas that have emerged maybe several years before. So if you're looking at Israel as a market, what technologies were implemented and what followed on and expanded in those drug discovery platforms. And I think that's something that's really valuable expertise to be brought to the party is like, when it comes to, people think sales technical support, oh, what are they giving us? Well, it's that line of sight to all the different sites around the world. And additionally, it's that ability to foster collaboration because, often you go from several projects to other projects and it's bringing those networks and expertise together, which is such a vital part, especially in a geographically broad area like Africa, where there's so much that is split apart across the continent, and it's that ability to put those centers of excellence together and to foster those collaborations of key networks.
Yes.
Yeah.
Jeff, you make a very valid point, and I think, what we try and do, and with most of these platforms, is have user meetings, fly people to various regions, centralize, have discussions, discuss that expertise so that there's knowledge sharing, maybe not with some of your own countrymen, but at least other Africans in the region. So I think that's a very valid point that you make. So coming back to the types of drug discovery labs that we typically see in Africa, I thought first, drug discovery, maybe someone who's new to this might say, okay, well, what exactly are we discussing here? And it's really just making sure that, we take a candidate drug or a candidate medication and really see if it's something unique. For example, a plant extract that we're testing that only grows in a certain region of Africa. That's kind of where we see a lot of natural product work being done. We also see people doing compound synthesis, whereby they would say, okay, let's make our own derivatives of various medications and test and see how that works. Some people also take various compound libraries and they kind of repurpose it for some of the unique diseases that we see in Africa, because we've got quite a wide variety of epidemiological issues, I would say, in the region. So, there's various shapes and forms that this takes, but ultimately what labs are trying to achieve, because no one just goes, okay, let's try and find a new medication. What the scientists are really trying to do here is, they want to cure ailments. They want to cure something like cancer. They want to look at epidemiological responses. So things like malaria, tuberculosis, HIV. They also non-communicable diseases, something that's become very prevalent in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think it's compounded by also having quite a very genetically diverse population group within sub-Saharan, so that things are almost compounded by complexity, so to speak, geographically, so to speak. So these are some of the challenges that your drug discovery labs would potentially want to address, and in some cases face within the region. So just to briefly explain the process, and I think we can always delve deeper into this in future discussions. The process itself is people would be looking at various assays, so find a drug of interest and then do in vivo, in vitro, or ex vivo type assays to really look at how to model that drug and how it behaves. And they want to pretty much take it through various stages, because ultimately what you want to produce is, as a government or as an entity, you can produce a medication that can help the general population with this. So there's various stages. In this case, I've just highlighted 4, but you've got early drug discovery, preclinical phase drug discovery, you've got your various clinical phases of drug discovery, and then finally you've got registration and regulatory approval of your drug of interest. And what we see in the region is typically most of the guys are doing early drug discovery type work as well as preclinical phase. There's some very advanced groups of scientists in Africa, guys that are really, amazing individuals that are doing fantastic work, that are actually have got some candidates in clinical phases and in the regulatory approval stages. So it's a very exciting space, very up and coming on the continent. All right, so some of the key areas where technologies that we supply would be required would be things like, normal benchtop tools. I'm going to highlight those. I'm going to highlight some of the isolation, purification, and QC tools that we also have and that some of the people are using on a day-to-day basis. I'm going to go a little bit into compound discovery work. I'm just going to highlight 1 or 2 theoretical workflows, because honestly, it's impossible to cover the, overall variety of what's being done. I'm going to go into some compound management, testing of those compounds, and then let's take the dream or the high-end technology and see how we can apply these really high-end and innovative technologies and really, as scientists in the region, have a differential that allows us to do an end-to-end type work. And then obviously go back to access African-based expertise, service and support training, as well as some of the networks, Jeff, that you mentioned, that we're working with various entities, and how people could potentially tie into something like that.
Cool. So just a question there. I mean, because it's always nice to contextualize it. What are some entities that are really doing a great job in the, in the Southern African region, that you've maybe collaborated with, that's really driving progress in the drug discovery place?
So, I mean, Jeff, it's such a wide variety or a mixed bag of things we're involved with. I can maybe take a step back and kind of give you a more of a wider context. Is we're fortunate enough to work with a company called Illumina. And Illumina has for many years really driven innovation in the next generation sequencing space. And what they tend to do is get very much involved with, government, population genomics, because in Africa, what we're seeing is, the sub-Saharan population is grossly underrepresented when it comes to, I'd say, genetic data that's out there, that's in the let's say, public domain. And what's interesting in that aspect is, by making sure that companies have more access and understand the genetic traits or variations that could be potentially in various pockets, makes the uptake of these medications that would be discovered a lot easier and a lot more relevant in terms of registration. Because it's one thing saying, okay, let's develop a drug, but then, genetically, 80% of the population is a, fast metabolizer of that drug of interest. So that would be a little bit more of a broader based context of some of the projects and things we're involved with. But similarly, we're also very much involved with drug discovery platforms that are doing absolutely phenomenal work. I can highlight someone like H3D. We've got some deep-rooted collaborations with them. They make use of a lot of our technologies, and we try and innovate and work with them pretty much. I'm based in the Western Cape, so I'm fortunate enough to have them on my doorstep. But H3D is really doing some very advanced stuff, and there's some really great scientists that are part of that program. And then Jeff, there's many others. I think I could probably rattle on for a few hours in terms of some of the other collaborations and things we've got going on.
No, awesome. So, yeah. We'll catch them up in the next episode. Maybe invite them on as well to tell their story and the progress.
That would be very cool. Definitely very cool. Awesome. Okay, so to kind of give an overview, I think we're fortunate in terms of our product portfolio that we definitely have all the key pieces under one roof. So if I look at something like your chemical synthesis platforms, we've got the ability to have either, as I mentioned earlier on, with natural products to do very much chromatography based and other types of isolation and purification from plants. I know you're very much involved in the cannabis space, and these are the types of technologies we would potentially position there also. And then we're also very active through a company called Bradley's and a few other companies where, when it comes to chemical synthesis, we're very active also. Once these compounds are isolated, we particularly would want our clients to store them. So we often, not always, recommend 2D barcoded tubes. And then we're fortunate enough to work with Hamilton Robotics, so we can actually automate this entire process, where we can have an automated compound storage platform, where if I, for example, said, okay, these are the 200 candidate drugs that I want to be testing this week, I can submit a list of those drugs to my store. The store goes and cherry picks them, puts them in a plate for me. From there, I actually put them on my liquid handling platform, and the liquid handler is then able to set up various types of assays of all types of testing that I want to do. We're also very fortunate to partner with someone like SciEx for very many years now. And SciEx themselves, in terms of mass spectrometry, also give us tools to be able to look at discovery-based technologies around compound discovery, as well as, compound testing. So we can do targeted mass spectrometry to then ultimately look at drug metabolism, that kind of thing. And then a space that's really, really exciting, that's really also taking off is bioprinting, how to kind of bypass or complement animal testing models. A lot of what we call high content screening, so where we can look at drug localization intracellularly, but we can do it over hundreds and thousands of samples. We can do it on a time scale. That's really exciting imaging technology that we can supply from a company called Molecular Devices, as well as Leica and various others. And then we also have, things like, if you want to design your own cell line, something, a cancer that you want to replicate, that you ultimately want to then test, or so forth. We've got a whole host of tissue culture, products and consumables and things within our organization, where our consultants can really advise people on how to go about setting up a type of an assay. So yes.
Awesome. I wanted to highlight something there quickly, because you mentioned the automated storage, and I think this is such an underrepresented aspect because, once you start scaling these platforms and you're creating these libraries of compounds, the moment a postdoctorate student pulls the wrong sample or pulls the wrong rack, and you start now proceeding with that compound, so much can be missed, or often investment is put behind the wrong, just because of a clerical error, where you've accidentally pulled the wrong compound from the wrong rack, and now you've gone and invested in all these additional studies, and then you later on realize, oh my word, we were checking the wrong compound. Like, in fact, we have to go back to the lab. I think that's quite an important point as this industry professionalizes around these product libraries, whether they're natural, single drug molecule libraries, like that need for control and automation in terms of the storage, the traceability is quite an important aspect that I like seeing that is starting to come to the continent.
Jeff, I can tell you some horror stories.
Yeah.
Where guys have had to run around for 2 weeks looking for a compound that they have to retest, that kind of stuff. So, and something like you don't have to start with an automated store. I mean, that's ultimately, if that's the dream and the vision, we can get you there. It starts with something as simple as this little 2D barcoded tube right here. If you start off and you archive your samples according to that, and you understand what's in those samples, then you can always automate that process later on. Same with your liquid handling. You can have someone set up a manual assay, but then when you are, going through various trials and regulations and product registrations and things like that, then it's very, very important to have that traceability. So you make a very, very good point.
Okay, yes. Awesome.
Cool. All right, but let's start with the base stuff. I mean, before we get to the crazy technology, every chemist needs these tools. And we're fortunate that we represent a host of different ones. I've picked out a few here, but I mean, something as simple as a centrifuge in your lab, or a little parallel synthesis reactor, or overhead stirrer. I think a chemist's bread and butter is a rotary evaporator, that kind of stuff. These are the things we supply. One thing we've seen in Africa is water purification solutions have become a needed commodity, because water is one of the only chemicals that you actually need to produce freshly on site. And we partner and have partnered with a company called Evoqua for many years, where we have even these simple deionization kits that you can plug into your taps, pre-filtration, as well as then higher end, water purification technologies. And something as simple as having a calibrated pipette is important in your lab, So we try and make sure that we can, provide across the board. If we go into, let's call it a little bit of a higher level of technologies, we work with a company called Teledyne Esco, and they've got fantastic flash purification technologies, prep scale, semi-prep scale purification. So that complements a way that we can then, as soon as the scientist understands that, okay, here's 1 or 2 compounds in this plant that I want to look at, they can extract that on a larger scale, and they can do even things like mass-directed purification to ultimately then allow for very pure compound synthesis, isolation and purification. And we have a host of complementary technologies like HPLC, various column chemistries, and things that we can also provide. SciEx gives us absolutely fantastic tools, and I'll touch on an example where, from a drug discovery point of view, as well as, drug testing, drug metabolism studies, ADME type work, SciEx is pretty much the gold standard out there. And then I've thrown this in because it's something we're seeing more and more of. We've got a very strong collaboration with someone like Cytiva, and the ACTA protein purification range is definitely something that is becoming very instrumental in a lot of these labs as they start searching for answers beyond the small molecule. So ACTA is definitely one of these key technologies that we are very fortunate that we can represent throughout Africa. So yes.
No, it's awesome to see the range of chromatography solutions. I mean, it's massive. Like, you're really covering the full spectrum from mass spec, HPLC, all the different resins, the standard resins, the protein-based resins. Like, it really enables quite a lot of diversity in terms of what to select that's ultimately going to best serve your end outcome of your workflow.
No, for sure. And I think what's nice is we've got a whole chromatography team at our company. So they're literally an email or a phone call away, and you'll get very good advice as to not only how to, purify a compound of interest, but how to potentially upscale that. So definitely innovative, and we've got a lot of technologies that tie into it. And I'll get to that a little bit later. But I mean, for example, you purify a compound, you need to, lyophilize it, for example. So I'll be touching on that in the coming slides. But what excites me often is something like compound discovery, because that's kind of like finding a needle in a haystack. And the needle to me is, how should I say, it can be anything, so to speak. So in this case, I've just taken some excerpts from, one of the workflows where we've used the SciEx QTOF. And work was actually done with a group in China to look at some traditional medicines. But whether you're doing it in China on Chinese traditional medicine, or whether you're doing it in Africa on African traditional medicines, it's the exact same thing. The nice thing with this is we use a host of technologies and software solutions where not only do we find the needle in the haystack, but we can characterize that needle very well. So we use high resolution mass spectrometry, which ultimately not only gives us, a proposed elemental composition, but it also has got various checks and balances to almost give us the amount of confidence to say, hey, it could be this compound. And we can search it against these giant databases to see, are we looking at something novel? Are we looking at something that's already characterized? So definitely when it comes to compound discovery, and we have a few of these platforms that are actually running in South Africa, but when it comes to this is right up our alley. So if people are interested, definitely reach out, let us know, and we can always foster some discussions on that front. So yeah, once we've found that needle in the haystack, I think that's when, how do we get more of the needle? And that's where solutions, like I mentioned earlier on with Teledinesco, is we could use things like mass-directed purification, UV-based purification. And as soon as we see the mass of interest, we can actually fractionate that mass out. We work with a company called Martin Christ, where we can do freeze-drying, lyophilization. And then from there, once you've got your powder, you can either store your powder or you can store it in DMSO and go to that automated, eventually to the automated compound storage workflows that we discussed in the previous slide. So this would be a very nice way of doing compound management. But as I said earlier on, the star of the show really is the tube. And I think if you have the tube in place, then you're set up to do various things going forward. So yes. All right. Now, once we've got our compounds, let's say they're in our theoretical store, like I mentioned earlier on, I could potentially say, okay, out of my 5,000 compounds that I've now isolated, or maybe even 5,000 fractions that I want to test for something as, simple as antimicrobial activity, I can then call up those fractions from my automated store. Here you'll see in the background, we've actually got an automated store that's integrated with a liquid handling platform. And what the liquid handler then does is it plates out my various assays in various concentrations. And we've got some complementary technologies where we can, bring in nano dispensing from a very exciting company called Bico. So ultimately, we can really set up those assays quite nicely. And I've worked with groups in Africa where we can set up 1 and 2 and 3 dimensional assays to start looking at synergistic effects of compounds, things like that. And how we test it further down the line, be it on a high content screening platform, be it on something as simple as a plate reader, or a mass spec, there's various ways of being able to test it. As I mentioned earlier on, some of these high content or high throughput screening platforms, especially in the confocal space, are really exciting. And that's allowing us to look at how drugs can localize, is it localizing on a specific point? And that gives us the surety, or scientists the surety, that they can across the board in a lot of cells, in a lot of wells, hundreds if not thousands of these, can actually then start doing time-based experiments and really see how different drug concentrations affect infection or something like that. So very exciting technologies.
No, that's super exciting to kind of know that, visualizing and understanding the mode of action of a lot of these compounds, because that kind of really informs your clinical stages. Like what is its known toxicity, what's going to be some of the side effects. Kind of characterizing that early on is definitely going to save money in which candidates you take to clinical development. And I'm sure you're going to discuss, often we go to animal studies as the next stage in the clinical phase. And that's also now starting to be revolutionized. And we're passionate about seeing new technologies in the spheroid space and the modeling space around replacement where possible of animal models.
No, for sure. And I mean, things like 2D, 3D cell cultures, that's definitely something that's very high on uptake. These, high throughput screening platforms definitely can do spheroid-based work, 3D cell culture-based work. So very exciting. And I think that brings me kind of into some of the stuff we're doing in terms of, bioprinting solutions. Here, I took some excerpts from a recent study where we kind of printed a mini heart. And we looked at how various medications and things, could almost, look at rejuvenation of those cells. So there's definitely very, very exciting technologies that are happening. And as I mentioned, that's from a company called Cellink. And the nice thing is, because this is such an innovative technology space, we can actually do live or even virtual demos for clients that are interested in this type of technology, because we've got the demo capacity in our laboratory. We've presented this technology at various forums. We've installed some of this technology at some of our key opinion leaders. So I think overall, it's very exciting to see where 3D printing is going to be taking this space, because it definitely eases the burden on your on your animal models and experiments and things going forward. Almost lose fast, lose cheap before you move it into the next phase of your product registration or clinical trial.
Yeah, absolutely. And we had some subject matters in the country the last 6 weeks, specifically doing training with key opinion leaders active in the space. So it's great to see that international presence and that skill transfer finding its way into Africa and into the demo laboratories, which I think is critical. I mean, at the end of the day, skill transfer is the key thing. We're always looking to drive in Africa, and African scientists enhancing and driving skill transfer is such a passion we share.
Course. And if you think any student coming out of any academic institution on our continent, having experience in this type of field and really being able to apply for any job on the global stage and say, hey, but I've worked with this stuff. Same we saw years ago when we started with liquid handling and robotics. You couldn't find someone that could program any of our robots, and now we've got hundreds of students that are coming out of various programs that have experience in terms of setting up scripting and really making robotics their own and being comfortable with these technologies. I see the same with bioprinting over the next, probably 2 to 5 years, I'd say. So, yeah.
Awesome.
Cool. Moving to the next one. As I said, Jeff, I'm a pictures kind of guy, and I like connecting dots. I like talking to people that want to trailblaze. I like having various products at our disposal, and I'm always very blessed with the exciting technologies that we represent. But what's nice is being able to connect the dots. Taking in this case, here is a project where we've taken almost like an automated cell culture chamber. It's from a company called Thermo. They've got Cytomat Solutions. We can grow cells in here, and then we can, feed those cells. We can dose those cells with various compounds and re-incubate them. And we've got a little robotic arm that can shuttle them from the actual incubator through to the plate reader. And that's quite a nice workflow, because that means you place your stuff on the deck, the robot kind of does the rest and does it on a scheduled time interval. So that's very exciting. I've kind of put a bare bones picture of a cytomat here, but it's typically enclosed, and it can, pretty much take on any kind of environmental composition. In this case, how you would look at this type of workflow is you'd start off with a store. Once again, you pull your compounds of interest, generate some plates, and then in this case have integrated cell culture as well as an integrated plate reader or reader of sorts. Now, Leica recently launched a technology called Mika, and I think anyone that's watching this video, please check it out. It's very exciting technology, but even things like this can be integrated with our platforms. The other thing is, once again, I highlight, taking those, being able to 3D print some of those cells eventually, and really doing those compound testing assays, and really trying to see ultimately how to unlock it. And it's all fair and well to have a visual model, and I think that's the nice thing that microscopy has always brought to the table is we get to see it. Even with a confocal, we get to see into the cell itself. However, what happens to a cell, from a genetics point of view? So we work with a company called Takara, and what Takara allows us to also do is pretty much then look at single cell analysis. So here, what I said is I used the example of the previous thing where they looked at, printing a micro heart, for example. We're taking it a step further now and see cause and effect. Okay, the heart muscle is now regenerated. Why? Genetically. And that's where Takara, with their single cell sequencing solutions, allow us to pretty much start looking at what's happening in that heart from a genetic standpoint. Be it RNA-seq type thing, really looking at what's getting expressed or not. This kind of brings that genomic component to the thing. And what's nice is now you've got, you've seen the morphology, now you start explaining it on a genetic level. And I propose, even going, a step up from that is we work, as I mentioned, with SciX. Now, SciX we can do with another company we're very fortunate in representing, a company called EvoSep. You can actually do high throughput quantitative proteomics. So we can then start taking these, models, and we can also look at what proteins are doing. Because one thing saying what's up and down regulated on a genetic level, but, is something being phosphorylated? Is it being, changed? And how is it being changed? And look at those changes and ultimately map them to metabolomics as well as genomics. So SciX has got a cloud-based solution where we can upload all of this data together, and we can then start looking at the full picture of what's really happening in this ecosystem and in those cells. And that's the kind of stuff that really excites me, because now I think to myself, wow, we went from picking a plant out of a region that it grows, and we've now found cause and effect. And if we can register that drug, if we can prove that it can cure something like heart disease, for example, then the region where that is grown can only benefit, because that circles back to farming, sustainable farming. It circles back to really producing a pharmaceutical industry that produces these compounds, and all done in Africa by African scientists, and also ensuring that we then build the infrastructure here, and that we can ultimately supply, our, let's call it, biodiversity intellectual property to the rest of the world through innovations that we've done, as opposed to kind of, piggybacking on what needs to be done. So, and as I mentioned, these dreams, these types of things, partnership is key. And, circling back to who are we? We're Separations. And I think the nice thing is we're a group of about 110 highly skilled individuals that have very different backgrounds. And, our passion, our aim is really not only to supply these types of solutions, but then to maintain, to support them, to get those networks together, really build those ecosystems and go, the age-old saying, farm to fork. I say, take it from, let's call it plant right through to drug of interest. And how can we then mass produce that for a global market, and opening up Africa to the rest of the world. So yes, where to from here? I think taking those dreams, turning into reality. As I said, we're passionate, science for Africa by Africans. I think that's always been something that's excited us. And it kind of got me thinking of this proverb, because what we're seeing is more and more of a disparity. If we don't invest in the infrastructure, that gap that we have becomes wider and wider over time, which means that we cannot cash in on our biodiversity intellectual property or any of the other intellectual property that are on our doorstep. And it makes me think of an old Nigerian proverb that basically said, a child who is carried on the back will not know how far the journey is. And that's where I feel if we walk that journey together, if we ensure that we build that ecosystem together, not only do we value what we've built, but we can actually really make that a sustainable economy for a global market, so to speak. So yeah, I think with that, I don't know if there's, Jeff, from your side questions. I don't know if there will be questions from the audience, and I implore anyone that has any questions, post it in the comments. Post follow-up questions. If there's more interest, we can always delve deeper. Jeff, you had a great idea of maybe bringing, one or two of our partners on to kind of see how they are using science on a day-to-day basis on the continent. So yeah, I think with that, I say thank you for the opportunity of being able to do this. And yeah, I think if there's questions, I look forward to answering them in the coming weeks.
Awesome, Grant. No, thank you. I can only say thank you for your time. I mean, it's amazing to see the work you've been driving, facilitating around drug discovery platforms. And I fully agree with the sentiment you've outlined there in terms of, that increasing need that a lot of this intellectual property is not just taken over abroad. It's that need for that infrastructure to be built domestically. And by having strong domestic presence and infrastructure, we can really start to own that IP. It's one thing, like the mining industry is a good example where, it was always export, export, export. And slowly they started pulling some of the processes domestically. Automation the automotive industry has also started to now build cars and vehicles in Africa. But it's important to have science and have drug discovery platforms that allow for things like the next pharmaceutical facility to be built to extract those compounds and commercialize those compounds in partnership, obviously, with other institutions that have experience. But Grant, thank you so much. It was a great presentation of the capabilities that Separations has on drug discovery platforms.
Thanks, Jeff. And I say cheers to everyone.
Awesome. Excellent. Thanks.